Olivia Reynolds lived in a charming, peaceful neighborhood, the kind you'd see in movies about perfect suburban life. Rows of neatly trimmed hedges lined the streets, and houses stood proudly with colorful flower beds out front. It was the kind of place where everyone smiled and waved. Even if they didn't know each other well, Olivia, at 39, fit perfectly into this picture. She was a nurse, known for her kind heart and tireless efforts to help anyone in need. Whether it was staying late at the hospital to comfort a frightened patient or volunteering at local food drives, Olivia was always giving. People often said she had the warmest smile in a way of making you feel like everything would be okay. Her husband Richard was equally admired. At 42, he was a well-respected architect whose designs graced many of the city's finest buildings. Neighbors often whispered about how lucky Olivia was to have a husband like him, hardworking, handsome, and charming. Together, they were known as the ideal couple, the pair who seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, a loving relationship, and the admiration of everyone around them. They hosted barbecues in the summer, shared laughs at community events, and exchanged small gifts with their neighbors during the holidays. But what people saw on the outside didn't always match what was happening behind closed doors. 2 years earlier, a new face had joined the neighborhood: Celeste Harper. She moved into the house right next door to the Reynolds. Celeste was an artist, and her work was as mysterious and intriguing as she was. With her flowing dark hair, piercing eyes, and effortless elegance, Celeste turned heads wherever she went. She could often be seen on her porch, sipping coffee while sketching in a worn notebook. Nobody knew much about her past, but her charm drew people in, especially Olivia. At first, Olivia and Celeste became fast friends. Celeste's passion for art fascinated Olivia, who loved hearing about the inspiration behind her paintings. Celeste, on the other hand, admired Olivia's selflessness and the way she seemed to juggle so much without ever complaining. They often spent afternoons together, chatting over cups of tea in Olivia's kitchen or strolling through the neighborhood. Olivia appreciated having a friend who was so different from her usual crowd. Celeste was bold and adventurous, with stories of her travels and art shows that left Olivia in awe. Richard, however, seemed indifferent to Celeste at first. He'd nod politely when they crossed paths and exchanged pleasantries at gatherings. But nothing more. At least that's what Olivia thought. Their marriage seemed solid on the surface, but cracks had begun to form. Richard's job demanded long hours, and he often worked late into the night. Olivia tried not to let it bother her after all. He was providing a good life for them, but there were moments when she felt the loneliness creeping in. Like when she cooked dinner for two but ate alone, or when she reached out to hold his hand, only to find him glued to his phone. She told herself this was normal after 10 years of marriage. Things weren't supposed to be as exciting as they were in the beginning, right? But sometimes, she wondered if they had lost something along the way. Meanwhile, Celeste's presence brought a new energy to Olivia's life. She encouraged Olivia to think about her own dreams and passions, things she hadn't considered in years. "You're always so busy taking care of others," Celeste once said. "What about you, Olivia? What makes you happy?" The question lingered in Olivia's mind, but she didn't have an answer. As time passed, Olivia noticed subtle changes in Richard's behavior. He became more distant, often brushing off her questions with vague answers. "Just work stuff," he'd say when she asked about his late nights. He seemed more preoccupied than ever. Yet there were moments when he appeared unusually cheerful, almost glowing. Olivia told herself it was probably a big project at work going well. She wanted to believe that, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she tried to ignore. Celeste, too, seemed different. She and Richard exchanged casual smiles and friendly nods when they saw each other. But there was something in the way they looked at one another that Olivia couldn't quite put her finger on. It was subtle, like a secret they weren't sharing with her. Olivia dismissed the thought as paranoia. Why would there be anything going on between them? Richard was her husband, and Celeste was her friend. She trusted them both, yet as the days went by, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Little moments started to stand out, like the way Richard would glance at his phone and quickly put it away when she entered the room, or how Celeste's laughter would linger just a little too long when Richard was around. Despite her growing unease, Olivia convinced herself that she was imagining things. After all, wasn't she happy? Didn't she have everything she'd ever wanted? A stable life, a loving husband, and a supportive friend? But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that her perfect world wasn't as perfect as it seemed, and soon she would discover just how right that feeling was. At first, Olivia thought Richard's late nights were just part of his job. Being an architect, he often talked about tight deadlines and big projects. She admired how dedicated he was, working tirelessly to provide for them. "It's for us," he'd say whenever she hinted he should slow down. Olivia believed him. She told herself it was just a phase, that things would go back to normal once his workload lightened. But as weeks turned into months, Richard seemed to drift further away. He started leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home even later at night. When he was home, he wasn't really there. He'd sit at the dining table with his laptop, barely looking up when Olivia spoke. She'd ask how his day went, and he'd sit at the dining table with his laptop, barely looking up when Olivia spoke. She'd ask how his day went, and he'd respond with one word, answers like fine or busy. Conversations that once flowed so easily now felt like walking through a maze, with walls growing higher every day. Olivia tried not to overthink it. She knew he was stressed, and she didn't want to add to his worries. She focused on her own life, her nursing shifts, her, her friendship with Celeste, and little projects around the house. But even as she busied herself, she couldn't ignore the growing silence between them. Then there were the phone calls. Richard started stepping out of the room whenever his phone rang. He'd grab his phone quickly, mutter, "I'll take this outside," and disappear onto the porch. When he returned, his face was a little too calm, like he'd rehearsed whatever explanation he was about to give. "Work stuff," he'd say with a shrug, but Olivia noticed he never really explained what that stuff was. One evening, while folding laundry, Olivia spotted Richard's phone lighting up on the counter. A message flashed across the screen before it disappeared. "Can't wait to see you." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. Maybe it was a colleague, a friend. She wanted to believe it wasn't anything suspicious, but the words lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Over time, other little things began to pile up. Richard started dressing nicer than usual, even on days he didn't have meetings. He wore cologne more often, the expensive one Olivia had given him for their anniversary, but that he usually saved for special occasions. And then there was the way he guarded his schedule. When Olivia asked what time he'd be home or if they could plan a date night, his answers were vague. "Not sure," he'd say, or "Let's play it by ear." The distance between them grew, like a canyon widening with each passing day. Olivia told herself she was imagining things, that she was just being insecure. But deep down, she couldn't help wondering if there was more to Richard's busy schedule than he let on. During this time, her friendship with Celeste became a lifeline. Celeste always knew how to make Olivia laugh, how to distract her from her worries. They spent hours talking about art, life, and everything in between. Celeste had a way of making Olivia feel seen and heard, something she hadn't felt with Richard in a long time. Richard seemed stressed lately. Olivia admitted one afternoon as they sat on Celeste's porch, sipping iced tea. Men can be like that, Celeste said with a soft laugh. They bury the way Celeste's eyes flickered when Richard's name came up in conversation. The way she casually mentioned seeing him around town, always brushing it off as a coincidence. Looking back, Olivia would later realize that the signs were there all along, like puzzle pieces scattered right in front of her. But in the moment, she trusted Celeste completely. Meanwhile, Richard's behavior became harder to ignore. "You're still up?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "I couldn't sleep," Olivia replied, her voice even. "You're home late." "Yeah, I had to meet a client," he said, avoiding her gaze as he set his back down. For a moment, Olivia thought about pressing him for details, but the tired look on his face made her stop. She didn't want to argue, didn't want to be the nagging wife who questioned his every move. So instead, she nodded and forced a smile. "You must be exhausted. I'll warm up some dinner for you. Don't worry about it," Richard said quickly. "I'm not hungry." As he disappeared upstairs, Olivia sat back down, her chest heavy with unanswered questions. The next morning, Celeste stopped by for coffee. Olivia shared her concerns, but Celeste dismissed them with her usual ease. "Richard loves you," she said, her tone light. "He's probably just under a lot of pressure. Give him time." Olivia wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that everything was fine, that the distance between her and Richard was temporary. But the unease in her chest grew stronger with each passing day. She couldn't have known that the truth was already unfolding right in front of her, that the people she trusted most were keeping secrets that would soon shatter her world. The first time Olivia felt the sharp sting of doubt was during a casual neighborhood barbecue. It was one of those sunny Saturday afternoons where kids ran around laughing, burgers sizzled on grills, and adults chatted over plates of potato salad. Richard and Olivia had hosted plenty of these events before, but this time they were guests at the Johnsons' house down the street. Everything seemed normal at first. Richard was mingling, his charming smile in full effect as he talked with a group of neighbors. Olivia stood by the buffet table, chatting with Mrs. Kramer about her garden. She was about to excuse herself to refill her drink when she noticed Richard and Celeste standing off to the side near the fence. At first, it seemed like an ordinary conversation. Celeste laughed at something Richard said, leaning in a little closer than Olivia thought was necessary. Richard's body language was relaxed, but there was a spark in his expression Olivia hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't just friendly, it was something more. Olivia tried to dismiss the thought. Maybe she was overreacting. Richard and Celeste had every reason to talk. They were neighbors after all. But as the barbecue went on, Olivia couldn't stop glancing in their direction. She noticed how Richard seemed to light up around Celeste, his laughter louder, his smile brighter, and Celeste, she had that same mysterious knowing look in her eyes. Like she was sharing a private joke with him, the uneasy feeling settled in Olivia's chest like a heavy stone. Later that evening, after they'd returned home, Olivia decided to shake it off. "You're just tired," she told herself as she prepared for bed. Decided to shake it off. "You're just tired," she told herself as she prepared for bed. Richard was already upstairs, scrolling through his phone as he lounged on the bed. She climbed in beside him, her mind still buzzing with doubts. As Richard got up to grab some water, he left his phone on the nightstand. Olivia wasn't the type to snoop, but when the screen lit up, she couldn't help but glance over. A message appeared for just a second before disappearing. "Last night was unforgettable. Can't stop thinking about it." Her breath caught. Who was it from? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. When Richard returned, she quickly looked away, pretending to scroll through her own phone. But her heart was pounding. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day in her mind. The laughter by the fence, the message on his phone. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, Olivia became hyper-aware of everything Richard and Celeste did. She noticed how Richard's tone changed when he talked to Celeste, how his laughter sounded just a little too genuine. Celeste, too, seemed to always appear when Richard was around, her eyes sparkling with something Olivia couldn't quite place. Determined to find out the truth, Olivia started paying closer attention. She didn't want to believe her worst fears, but she also couldn't let them go. She began watching for patterns. Richard's sudden late nights, Celeste seemingly casual drop-ins at their house when she thought Olivia wasn't home. Then came the overheard conversation. It happened one afternoon while Olivia was pruning the roses in their backyard. Richard and Celeste were standing on the other side of the fence, their voices low, but not low enough. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Celeste said, her voice tinged with worry. "It's fine," Richard replied quickly. "Olivia has no idea." The pruning shears slipped from Olivia's hands, landing in the grass with a soft thud. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Are you sure?" Celeste asked. "She's not stupid, Richard. She might start putting things together." "She won't," Richard said firmly. "I've got this under control." Olivia felt the air leave her lungs. She stayed crouched behind the rose bush, her hands trembling. She didn't hear the rest of their conversation. Her mind was too busy spinning out of control. The words echoed in her head for the rest of the day. "She has no idea. I've got this under control." That night, Olivia could barely look at Richard. Every time he smiled at her, every time he said something casual or kind, it felt like a lie. She wanted to confront him right then and there, to demand the truth. But something held her back, a fear of what she might hear, of what would happen if she was right. Instead, Olivia threw herself into gathering more proof. She started keeping a notebook, jotting down every detail that felt off. A late-night text, a sudden meeting, Celeste's name popping up too often in casual conversation. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer, and with it came a crushing sense of betrayal. The man she thought she knew, the marriage she thought she had, it all felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Olivia knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to uncover the whole truth, no matter how much it hurt. And when she did, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Olivia had always thought of herself as a calm, rational person, but as the days passed, the weight of her suspicions grew unbearable. Her mind buzzed with questions she couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? How could Richard betray her like this? And why so, lest her friend of all people love, she decided it was time to stop wondering and find out the truth. But instead of confronting Richard directly, Olivia made a plan. She would catch them in the act. That way there could be no excuses, no lies, and no way for Richard to talk his way out of it. For the next few days, Olivia acted like everything was fine. She smiled when Richard came home late, asked how his work was going, and even made his favorite dinners. She wanted him to believe she was clueless. "Work's been hectic," Richard said one evening, kissing her on the cheek as he grabbed his coat. "I have to stay late again. Don't wait up for me, okay?" Olivia nodded, her heart pounding. "Of course, take your time." As soon as the door closed, she sprang into action. She grabbed her keys and purse, slipped on a jacket, and quietly followed Richard's car down the dimly lit streets of their neighborhood. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she trailed him, careful to keep a safe distance. She didn't want to believe what she was doing, but deep down, she knew she had to. She couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. Finally, Richard's car turned onto a familiar street. Olivia's stomach twisted into knots as he pulled into Celeste's driveway and parked. It was too late for a friendly visit. The lights in Celeste's living room glowed softly, and Olivia could see shadows moving inside. Her heart sank. This was it. The proof she didn't want, but desperately needed. She parked a few houses down, her breath shaky as she sat in her car, staring at the house. For a moment, she thought about driving away, pretending she hadn't seen anything. But she couldn't. She had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Taking a deep breath, Olivia stepped out of her car and walked towards Celeste's house. Her footsteps felt heavy, each one echoing louder in her ears. Steps felt heavy, each one echoing louder in her ears. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could hear faint laughter inside, Richard's deep chuckle and Celestic giggle. Rage and heartbreak swirled inside her as she knocked sharply on the door. The laughter stopped. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there stood Richard, his face frozen in shock. "Olivia," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Behind him, Celeste appeared, her expression a mix of guilt and surprise. She was wearing a loose sweater, her hair casually pulled back, as if this was just another cozy evening at home. "What? What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice shaky. "I should be asking you that." Olivia replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. She stepped inside, her gaze darting between the two of them. "So, this is where all your late nights have been spent?" Olivia. "It's not what it looks like," Richard began. But Olivia cut him off. "Don't insult me by lying." She snapped, her eyes glistening with tears. "I followed you here, Richard. I've been piecing this together for weeks. The texts, the whispers, the way you've been acting around her. Do you think I'm blind?" Richard looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Celeste shifted uncomfortably, her usually confident demeanor nowhere to be found. "I trusted you," Olivia said, her be found. "I trusted you," Olivia said, her voice cracking. "Both of you. I thought we were friends, Celeste. How could you do this to me?" "Olivia?" Celeste started, but she faltered under Olivia's piercing stare. "You what?" "Didn't mean for this to happen." Olivia's tone was sharp. "Do you think that makes it better?" Richard finally spoke, his voice desperate. "I'm sorry, Olivia. I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. It just happened." Olivia repeated, her voice rising. "That's the best you can come up with?" "You betrayed me, Richard. You broke our marriage, our trust. And for what? For her?" Celeste flinched at the words, but Olivia didn't care. She was too hurt, too angry to hold back. Richard reached out as if to comfort her, but she stepped away. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't you dare try to make this okay." The room fell silent, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on all three of them. Olivia could feel her heart breaking, the life she thought she had crumbling before her eyes. Finally, she turned to leave, her voice trembling as she said, "I hope you're both happy. Because you've destroyed everything." As Olivia stepped out into the cool night air, tears streamed down her face. She walked back to her car, feeling numb, yet painfully alive all at once. Sitting behind the wheel, she gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, was gone. She had to face the truth now, no matter how much it hurt. For the first time in years, Olivia wasn't sure who she was without Richard. But one thing was clear. She couldn't stay in the shadows of his lies any longer. The news of Richard and Celeste's affair spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. In a community where everyone's lives seemed perfect, the scandal was all anyone could talk about. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, trading stories and speculating about how long it had been going on. Some sided with Olivia, sympathizing with her pain and betrayal. "Poor thing," Mrs. Kramer said to her friend over coffee. "She's always been so kind. She didn't deserve this." Others, however, were less forgiving. "Well, Maybe she wasn't paying enough attention to Richard, Mr. Thompson muttered during a backyard barbecue. Men don't just stray for no reason. Olivia could feel the weight of everyone's judgment every time she stepped outside. What hurt even more was knowing that her private heartbreak had become a public spectacle. It felt like her life was unraveling in full view of everyone she once trusted. Richard moved out of their house just days after the confrontation. Olivia told him she needed space to think, and he didn't argue. He packed a suitcase and left, though he looked like he wanted to say something before he walked out the door. Olivia didn't give him the chance. The emptiness of the house was overwhelming at first. Everywhere Olivia turned, there were reminders of the life she thought she had. The wedding photo on the mantel, the anniversary card Richard had given her last year, the coffee mug he used every morning. They all seemed to mock her. Despite the pain, Olivia tried to carry on with her life. She threw herself into her work at the hospital, taking extra shifts to keep herself busy. She avoided the neighborhood gatherings she once loved, not ready to face the pitting looks and awkward conversations. Meanwhile, Richard and Celeste weren't faring much better. The affair had shattered their carefully constructed images. Richard's co-workers, once impressed by his charm and professionalism, now viewed him differently. The whispers and side glances in the office made it clear that his reputation was tarnished. Celeste, too, faced the fallout. Neighbors who once admired her artistry now avoided her entirely. The invitations to social events stopped coming, and her once thriving art business began to struggle. Clients canceled orders, and her studio, which used to buzz with visitors, grew quiet. One evening, Olivia overheard two women talking at the grocery store. "Did you hear about Celeste?" Quiet. One evening, Olivia overheard two women talking at the grocery store. "Did you hear about Celeste? She's practically a pariah now. Serves her right." Olivia felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her thought they deserved it, but another part felt uncomfortable with how quickly people turned on them. As the weeks went by, Olivia began to feel a different kind of pain. One that wasn't about Richard or Celeste, but about herself. She realized how much she had let her marriage define her identity. For years, she'd been Richard's wife, the dependable nurse, the perfect neighbor. But who was she now? One night as she sat alone in the quiet living room, Olivia made a decision. She couldn't let this betrayal consume her. She had to take back control of her life, not for anyone else, but for herself. The next morning, Olivia started making changes. She cleared out the house, packing away the things that reminded her of Richard. She redecorated the living room with vibrant colors and hung new artwork on the walls, pieces she had picked out for herself. She also started attending a local yoga class, something she had always wanted to do but never made time for. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Emma, encouraged her to focus on healing and self-discovery. "I know it's hard now," Emma said after class one day, "but this is a chance to figure out what you want out of life." Olivia began journaling, writing down her thoughts and feelings each day. At first, the pages were filled with anger and sadness, but over time, they shifted. She wrote about her dreams, her goals, and the kind of person she wanted to be. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Olivia ran into Celeste. It was the first time they had spoken since the night everything fell apart. Celeste looked tired, her once bright eyes clouded with guilt. "Olivia, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything." Olivia stared at her for a moment, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to lash out, to make Celeste feel the pain she had caused. But instead, Olivia took a deep breath. "I don't forgive you," she said honestly, "at least not yet. But I hope you learn from this. I hope you become better." Celeste nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I hope so too." Walking away, Olivia felt lighter somehow. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was taking steps toward healing. In the months that followed, Olivia found strength she didn't know she had. She reconnected with old friends, pursued new hobbies, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. She realized that while her marriage had ended, her life was far from over. The neighborhood eventually moved on, as neighborhoods always do. New scandals emerged, new gossip spread. But for Olivia, the experience was transformative. She wasn't just the woman who had been betrayed. She was someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt free. Thank you for being with me so far in the video. If you like the video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support is a great favor to us. Thanks to all dear ones.